Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Conspiracy Iceberg. This is part 3 in an ongoing series. If you're a new viewer, there's a playlist on my channel you can watch to see the previous 2 parts, although it isn't necessary to understand this video. So without further ado, let's get into layer 3. Regi Nuke Connection. This wasn't on the actual iceberg image, but I did mention this theory in the previous layer, and commenters did say they wanted me to fully explain it, so I will do so here. This is actually a pretty old theory that originated on the Japanese side of the internet, most likely over a decade ago and probably closer to 2 decades ago. However, it has been spread over the internet since, and people have contributed their own bits of evidence over the years. I'll basically be curating it down and cutting out what I think are stretches. I'll just be including the stuff that I think was intentional by Game Freak, because I do very much think that this theory is somewhat true. This theory revolves around the group of legendaries informally called the Regis, specifically the original 3 from Generation 3, Regirock, Regice, and Registeel, as well as their master from Generation 4, Regigigas. The process to catch the Regis in Gen 3 is by far the most convoluted in the entire series. Never before, nor after, have we seen such complex and strange steps to access legendary Pokemon, which is made even weirder by the fact that the process seemingly has no significance in-game. While most have just written it off as a weird creative choice, some have theorized that the process is supposed to be a tribute to the Hibakusha, or survivors of the atomic bombings of Japan in World War II. So what is the relevance here? Well, first we've got location. The Hoenn region is based on the Japanese island of Kyushu. I mean, it's literally just Kyushu rotated 90 degrees. A city in Kyushu that many around the world will recognize is Nagasaki, the site of the second atomic bombing of Japan, the city whose destruction was directly responsible for the surrender of the Japanese Empire and the end of World War II. More evidence emerges once we look into the actual process to unlock the Regis. Across the Hoenn region, specifically in an ancient chamber as well as the 3 chambers where the Regis are, there are inscriptions that you can translate from Braille. They differ across games, but I will be using the translations from the original Ruby and Sapphire. Here are some of the notable quotes from these chambers. Dig here. In this cave we have lived. We owe all to the Pokemon, but we sealed the Pokemon away. We feared it. Those with courage, those with hope, open a door. An eternal Pokemon waits. First comes Relicanth, last comes Wailord. Stop and wait. Wait for time to pass twice. With new time, hope and love, aim to the sky in the middle. So we start off with the quote, dig here, and in this cave we have lived, which could be taken to mean in this cave we have lived on, or in this cave we have survived. This can be interpreted as people literally digging bomb shelters and surviving. We'll get to the rest of this phrase later. First comes Relicanth, last comes Wailord. This is referring to the 2 Pokemon you need in your party to access the chambers of the Regis, and where in your party you need to put them. These seem like 2 random water-type Pokemon, but people discussing this theory have pointed out that they could be a reference to the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan, Little Boy and Fat Man. First comes Relicanth, or Little Boy, last comes Wailord, or Fat Man. It makes sense, as Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima first, on August 6, 1945, while Fat Man was dropped last, on August 9, 1945. Stop and wait. Wait for time to pass twice. This could mean that while in the underground shelter, you have to wait twice for the 2 bombs to drop. With new time, hope and love. Although war has devastated Japan, they did rebuild towards a better future and establish good relations with the nation they were once at war with, hope and love. So yeah, these inscriptions can be interpreted as an account of Japan surviving the atomic bombs. But what about the phrase, we owe all to the Pokemon, but we sealed the Pokemon away? Those with courage, those with hope, open a door, an eternal Pokemon awaits. Well, this could be referring to how Japan has treated survivors of the atomic bombings, or Hibakusha. Of course, they should be respected and taken care of for what they had to go through, surviving the worst weapons humans have ever created. However, despite the horrors they had to endure, after the war, survivors would often be shunned and discriminated against by fellow Japanese people. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many people were afraid that survivors carried radiation sickness, almost like a contagious disease, and that stigma stuck around for a while, so Hibakusha were basically shunned and forced to go into isolation. They were basically sealed away. It wasn't until decades later that the Japanese government actually started providing aid, recognition, and compensation to the Hibakusha, and the stigma would decrease among the younger generations, who would give Hibakusha a platform to share their stories. Those with courage and hope ended the stigma. Oh yeah, and why were the inscriptions in Braille? Well, simple. Atomic bombs are pretty well known for how blinding they are, and they can blind people due to the extreme amounts of light and heat given off. So, what else supports this theory? Well, there are aspects of the Regis themselves that support their connection with nuclear bombs. For example, all three of them learn explosion at level 1. Also, in later generations, they learn hyper beam, which is called destruction beam in Japan, at level 89. Level 89 could be referring to the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th, or 8/9. Now let's move on to the Generation 4 Pokemon Regigigas. Well, we can also look at its location. It's located in Snow Point Temple, which is at the very north of the Sinnoh region. Sinnoh is based in the Japanese island of Hokkaido, and at the northernmost point of Hokkaido is Cape Soya, which has many monuments, including some that advocate for peace and hope. While none are related to the atomic bomb directly, I think these memorials remembering victims of war, as well as other memorials expressing hope and peace for the future, are close enough. And finally, where do Regieleki and Regidrago fit into this? Initially, I just wanted to write them off as irrelevant, but that's before I learned several things. Regieleki and Regidrago are located in the Crown Tundra, a DLC area in Sword and Shield which is based on Scotland. Scotland is pretty involved with denuclearization movements, both internationally and locally, as a big part of the Scottish independence movement is getting rid of the nuclear submarine fleet that Britain stations in Scotland. So there's a connection to nuclear weapons there. Also, Regieleki and Regidrago are both explicitly said to be made of energy, in contrast to how the original three Regis were made of physical matter. This could be a loose connection to how nuclear weapons essentially turn a small amount of matter into a huge amount of energy. XY was a response to BW. Pokemon fans nowadays will know that among all the generations, Generation 5 is one of the most beloved by the community. Many people praise the animated 2D sprite work, story, characters, difficulty, and overall polish. However, if you're involved with the online community in the early 2010s to around 2017, you would know that the Gen 5 games were actually quite hated in that time. And the negativity towards the Gen 5 games didn't just come after the fact. The Generation 5 games sold very poorly compared to the generations before, which were generally selling more per passing generation, barring the insane sales of Gen 1. Now, there were a lot of reasons why this could have been the case. They were sold at the very end of the DS lifespan, they came out while most families were dealing with the Great Recession, and as such didn't have a lot of disposable income, stuff like that. But there were also other actual criticisms of the game, like a lot of people complaining at how bad many of the Pokemon were. Whether or not you think it's unfair, I do think Game Freak did hear a lot of these criticisms. While technically not confirmed, some people do theorize that Pokemon X and Y were actually a response to criticisms of the Generation 5 games. Here are some examples. A big criticism of the Generation 5 games were their 2D graphics. This may come as a surprise to modern Pokemon fans, since one of the biggest criticisms of the modern games is that the 3D graphics are bad and soulless compared to the 2D sprites, with many holding up Black and White as an example of an art style the series should have stuck with. But yes, the art style was heavily criticized upon release. The thing is, Game Freak actually wanted to keep the 2D art style well into the future. In a 2009 interview, Junichi Masuda said that Game Freak did not want to consider switching to 3D, as Game Freak saw 2D as a key aspect of Pokemon's visual style, and that while 3D can be more realistic, they could put a lot more expression into the 2D artwork. It's funny because the biggest supporters of 2D Pokemon today use the same exact reason to point out why they think 2D Pokemon is superior. However, you have to remember that the gaming community in general, in 2010, was a lot different than the gaming community of today. Back then, going for a more realistic 3D style was the trend, and most people wanted to see Pokemon in a more realized 3D world. Other staple Nintendo games had gone 3D over a decade before then, and fans knew that the other flagship Nintendo franchises like Mario and Zelda were able to put 3D games in worlds on the DS. So when Game Freak came out in 2010 and subsequently 2012 with more 2D games that functionally worked the same as the original Red and Blue in 1996, many in the Pokemon community saw that as proof of Game Freak's laziness, that they would rather cut corners by making 2D games instead of moving on to 3D like everyone else. Now, do I think this was the sole reason why Game Freak switched to 3D? Absolutely not. Game Freak knew that the switch to 3D was inevitable. Even in that 2009 interview I mentioned earlier, Masuda did say that they would switch to 3D in the future if necessary. Also, I don't think Nintendo would have allowed Game Freak to continue making 2D games for their new handheld console called the 3DS. They'd want to show off the increased graphical fidelity, but I'm sure the community's want for 3D Pokemon certainly encouraged them further. However, one criticism that I do think directly affected Game Freak's mindset in designing the Generation 6 games were the hate that the Gen 5 Pokemon themselves got. Now, the fact that a lot of people dislike the new designs is one thing. Like, when every new generation comes out, you have people hating on the new designs, and then as time passes, the new designs eventually are accepted into the roster. But one of the biggest criticisms of the initial Gen 5 releases, Black and White, was that it only restricted you to new Pokemon and barred older Pokemon until the postgame. The Gen 5 roster were among the most hated Pokemon for almost a decade. So what did Game Freak do in X and Y? Well, not only did they bring back old fan favorites front and center, they encouraged you to use them. Oh, those are some cool new starters you have. Well, almost immediately after, you get the Kalos starter, Professor Sycamore gives you the old favorite Kanto starters, now with new fancy Mega Evolutions. Mega Evolution as a whole is just a way to give the spotlight again to older fan favorites, to make them more special for longtime fans. Combine that with the fact that Generation 6 has the least amount of newly added Pokemon out of all the generations, it makes me think they deliberately tried putting as little focus on the new Pokemon because people hated that Gen 5 put so much focus on the new Pokemon. Pokemon don't lay eggs. This is a theory that I actually just privately had as a headcanon. The idea is that Pokemon don't actually lay eggs, and it's basically just a placeholder for the various ways different Pokemon give birth. The idea that all Pokemon lay eggs is pretty suspicious, like I doubt the mammals or the humanoid Pokemon lay eggs. This is further supported in Universe, where it seems like the breeders don't really know where the eggs come from, they just appear. Although this could be them lying to the child player, not really wanting to get into the anatomical intricacies of Pokemon breeding. And I guess this is the actual reason why they only lay eggs in the games. Pokemon wanted to introduce a breeding mechanic. The easiest way to do so is through a universal egg system. I think it's fairly obvious that eggs are just a shorthand, as various things in the Pokemon universe make no sense if we assume Pokemon are born from eggs. For example, Kangaskhan being hatched from an egg with a baby already in its pouch, or Porygon, a digital Pokemon, also somehow hatching out of physical eggs. It's very likely that other forms of reproduction exist in the Pokemon universe, like I at least hope the humans don't lay eggs, but Game Freak just uses eggs as a shorthand for all the different ways the miracle of birth can happen. Pronouncing Arceus. Well, you just heard how I pronounce him. Since he was introduced in Gen 4, fans have been conflicted on how to pronounce the name of the Pokemon god himself, Arceus. And if you think that there's an official source that can clear up the confusion, think again, since even they can't seem to agree on a pronunciation. Official Japanese sources have pronounced it Arceus, and this is similar to how most English fans pronounced it for a long time, Arceus with a soft C. However, official English sources like the anime dubs would pronounce it Arceus with a hard K. This is because if you pronounce the name with a soft C, it contains the British curse word arse, which is probably a no-no for children's broadcasting in English. I do think that the name should be pronounced with a hard C, as that would be pronounced like the word ark, like the ark surrounding his body, and there's the connection to the biblical word ark, which is used to describe a holy vessel. That's pretty accurate to Arceus' description. Also, in Legends Arceus, you get the Arc phone, not the Ars phone. And why do I call it Arceus? Well, because of Silvally. Silvally is a man-made attempt to recreate Arceus, and its ability, RKS system, allows it to change type depending on what it's holding, like Arceus. The RKS in the ability name is literally the letters RKS, and I'm willing to count this as the official pronunciation since it's the only hint that we got to one in the mainline games. Or you can go the M&JTV route and call him Arceus, you recall. Voltorb is Haunter. The crux of this theory is that Voltorb and Haunter have the same eye shape, so people speculated that Voltorb is actually Haunter possessing a Pokeball. I mean, it's fairly obvious this is just how Ken Sugimori stylized angry eyes in the Gen 1 art. I doubt there was supposed to be a connection here. This is probably the least interesting of the theories connecting the Gengar line to other Pokemon. Giovanni wants to stop Mewtwo. What exactly was Team Rocket doing in the Gen 1 games? Besides the low-level crime they involved themselves in, their higher-stake operations involved two key items, the Silph Scope and the Master Ball. The Silph Scope is used to identify and catch Ghost-type Pokemon, and the Master Ball can capture any Pokemon without fail. So, some people theorize that Giovanni was preparing for a fight with Mewtwo. He was trying to collect Ghost-type since they have an advantage against Mewtwo's Psychic-type, even though technically the Gen 1 Ghosts don't actually, but whatever. And then he can use the Master Ball to capture Mewtwo. However, since the player thwarts both these operations, he no longer has any counter to Mewtwo, and thus quits the mission to capture Mewtwo. Some people say that he was doing this to protect the world from Mewtwo, that he knew how destructive it was and wanted to stop it before it could hurt more people. But it's pretty obvious that if he caught Mewtwo, he'd use it for his own selfish criminal goals. I mean, it's basically confirmed with the Rainbow Rocket version of Giovanni. This is a Giovanni from a world where he succeeded in his goals, and his team here includes a Mewtwo, one that he Mega Evolves to boot. I do think this is canon. There's definitely enough in the games to hint at the idea that Giovanni wanted to take on and capture Mewtwo for himself in the Gen 1 games. Immortal AZ Floette. Once again, less of a theory and more of a fact. Both AZ and his Floette lived like 3,000 years ago and are still alive to this day. They were both in the proximity of the ultimate weapon when it used its life energy to bring Floette back from the dead, so maybe the life energy was so strong it gave them both eternal life. Kogita wrote the old verses. In Legends Arceus, you can find 20 old verses buried throughout the region. All of them are stated to have the same author. It's also implied, if not outright stated, that the author of these verses is an immortal who initially came from the original Celestica people. They talk about how everyone they know is dead, and how the Celestica people are gone, and how lonely and alone they are. Well, this fits with how Kogita used to be of the Celestica people, but now lives alone in her own little hidden village. Also, the person who wrote the old verses mentions talking to a god of spring, which we know is Enamorus. And the one person who's a friend of Enamorus in the game itself is none other than Kogita. So yeah, Kogita almost definitely is the author of the old verses, meaning she's immortal. After all, when we get Enamorus, she mentions leaving it in our care for now, implying that once we die, Enamorus will just leave and join her again. A cool little bit of world building. Silver is Ash's father. Not Giovanni's son Silver. In the Pokemon Chronicles anime, which is basically a series of side stories to the main Pokemon anime, there is a character named Silver who shows up in one episode. This character seems like he knows Ash, according to his reaction when the name is mentioned to him. Personally, it does seem like a stretch. It's entirely possible this is just him repeating the name. But if we do assume this means he knows of Ash, he would have known of him from before Ash started his journey, as he never actually meets Ash during any of Ash's episodes. Also, there's a lot of parallels between Silver and Ash. Like, they both carry around a first stage starter on their shoulder, and they both start their personal journeys by witnessing a fire-flying type legendary bird, with Ash seeing Ho-Oh and Silver seeing Moltres. Also, they both have the same brash but determined personality. Also, with Silver himself being headstrong and somewhat immature despite his age, it would make sense that he'd prioritize adventuring over settling down and raising a son. He doesn't seem like a family man. But this is a pretty good theory for who Ash's dad is. Indian region exists. Since very early in the series' lifetime, it's been heavily implied that there is some sort of an Indian region. Of course, people know about the Indian elephant reference in Raichu's Fire Red Dex entry, which is also mentioned in the Sun Dex entry for Raichu. This explicit mention of the Indian elephant was changed to Kaparaja in Raichu's Legend Arceus Dex entry. So it's fairly obvious that Kaparaja is supposed to be a stand-in for an Indian elephant, meaning Kaparaja comes from some India-based region. This isn't the only Indian Pokemon, though. The Pokedex entry for the Yungoos line mentions that they were brought to the Alola region from another region to deal with the Rattata outbreak. This is a reference to how the mongoose in Hawaii was actually imported to Hawaii from India to control a rat outbreak. So the Yungoos line also implies an India region. We've also got human characters that look like they could be of potential Indian origin. Like, there's a bunch in Galar, which makes sense since Galar is based in the UK, and the UK has a significant population of South Asian origin. Like, we've got Leon and Hop, who seem to be descendants of Laventon, who says that Kaparaja is from his home region. Considering that Laventon is Galarian, he could be referring to Galar, but it's also possible that he was from an Indian region and moved to Galar before moving to Hisui for research. So if he's Indian, Leon and Hop are, and if you look closely, their mom also looks like she's of Indian ethnicity. Also, Rose and Peony, as well as Peony's kids, all seem to be of Indian descent, which actually means that Penny is half Indian, which is something you wouldn't expect by looking at her initially. Raihan can also be of Indian descent due to his skin tone and name, as well as Geeta. Also, the Galar games heavily featured curry, which I know is a staple of British cuisine, but it was brought to Britain from India. So yeah, it seems like an Indian region very much exists in the Pokemon world. There's definitely more evidence for it than any other country having a regional equivalent. A game taking place there is basically inevitable at this point. Dodrio Flying. One of the classic Pokemon memes is Dodrio Flying. Dodrio is a flying type, but it's based on a flightless bird and actually has no wings. Despite this, it can learn Fly to transport the player across far distances. So, how? There are several explanations to describe this. The most boring one is that they do have wings that just appear when using the move Fly. One explanation that I like is that since they're based on ostriches, which have very strong legs, they just jump ridiculously high, which is a fun image. Even more fun is the idea that they fly by spinning their three heads around like helicopter blades, or maybe they use the two side heads as flapping wings. SS Ann Policeman is Looker. In the Generation 1 games, there's an NPC in the SS Ann who says that he's part of the International Police, or Global Police, I guess that's probably a different translation of the same word. He says he's on the trail of Team Rocket. Some people say that this is actually the first appearance of Looker in the series before he got a name. While I'm usually cynical about headcanons like this, as the more reasonable explanation is that it's just another Interpol agent, there is evidence to back it up. In Pokemon Generations, Looker is actually involved in an international police operation to arrest Giovanni, but just barely misses out on catching him. So now that we know this, it is plausible that this undercover man is a younger Looker, especially considering that we know that Looker specializes in disguises and going undercover. Although he's a pretty awful undercover agent if he just tells some random kid that he's an undercover agent working for the international police. But that does still track with Looker. Giratina and Necrozma's Abrahamic symbolism. Both Giratina and Necrozma parallel figures in Abrahamic religion, specifically Lucifer, Satan, whatever you want to call him. Giratina is a more obvious parallel. Sinnoh as a whole is the closest Pokemon ever got to making a proper creation religion for their world, with Arceus being an explicit parallel to the Abrahamic creator god. Like the Abrahamic god, Arceus made servants to help him, with the most prominent being Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. However, according to legend, Giratina was banished to the Distortion World, presumably by Arceus for its violence. This seems like it took direct inspiration from how Lucifer was said to have rebelled against God and caused a war in heaven, only to be banished and imprisoned in hell by God. However, it seems like the Pokemon version of the myth seems to be more nuanced, as it's never explicitly stated that Giratina was evil. In fact, in Platinum, it's responsible for saving the world. It seems like he was just created to be destructive, and he got his own little distortion world since that was his place in the universe. And it doesn't seem like he was banished, he can come to our world anytime he wants. Necrozma's Abrahamic connections can come from its role as basically the god of light. Oftentimes, titles given to Lucifer include the Morning Star or Lightbringer, and both titles fit Necrozma very well. Also, Lucifer was often considered the most beautiful angel, proud of his angelic light, before all that was taken away. Similarly, Necrozma's original form is beautiful, almost angelic, but once again, all that was taken away from him. Evil Pokemon exist. This entry was talking about some episode in the anime, but I think it's a lot more interesting to look at it in the context of the games. Even though we just talked about Pokemon being based off of Satan, we never actually had evil Pokemon until very recently. Usually you would think the destructive legendaries would be evil, but that usually isn't the case. Mewtwo is destructive, but it ultimately doesn't trust people, the scientists that created it, and it just wants to be left alone. There are Pokemon that represent concepts like chaos and death, but they're not evil, they're just fulfilling their roles in the universe, or just acting out on their instincts. Is a tiger evil for hunting others? These are godlike beings. It's not their fault their existence threatens us, like how our existence threatens ants even though we aren't specifically targeting them. However, Scarlet and Violet did change this. First are the Treasures of Ruin. Once again, it can be argued that they have no sentient choice not to be evil, but considering that they are explicit manifestations of the evil acts of humanity, I can consider them evil Pokemon. They're not innately destructive, they're just straight up innately evil. The other evil Pokemon are Pecharunt and the Loyal 3. Pecharunt is a mythical Pokemon which has the ability to make poisonous mochi, and whoever eats this mochi is put under its control. Pecharunt enjoys the attention it gets from the control it has over other people. Similarly, the Loyal 3 are retainers of Pecharunt, Pokemon who gave up their independence to Pecharunt in exchange for receiving more power, intelligence, or beauty respectively. They all desired the beautiful masks of Ogerpon and her human companion, so they snuck up on their home, killed Ogerpon's human companion, and tried to run away with the masks. However, Ogerpon was able to take revenge and kill the Loyal 3 while Pecharunt fled. This story is the closest we ever got to an individual Pokemon being knowingly evil, rather than Pokemon that were under the control of evil trainers or Pokemon that are just kind of inherently destructive. De-evolution. De-evolution is an interesting concept. Pokemon evolution is more of a metamorphosis than scientific evolution. They suddenly change form. So, can they change back? Well, not in-game. However, some of Slowbro's Pokedex entries say that if the Shelder biting its tail lets go, it will become a Slowpoke again. So that's basically canon de-evolution. And then, of course, technically every Pokemon that can Mega Evolve can also devolve, since it devolved from their Mega form back to their normal form, but that's not the same thing as permanent evolution, being reversed. Anime is an in-universe cartoon. This theory states that the Pokemon anime is actually a show that airs within the universe of the games. This is why Pikachu, over time, grew more popular among NPCs in the games themselves, even being treated like celebrities in Alola. It's because Ash's Pikachu from the anime was so popular, it made all Pikachu fan favorites. Also, in the Sun and Moon demo, the player received a Battle Bond Greninja from someone. While Battle Bond was initially just something exclusive to Ash and his Greninja in the anime, it became a Pokemon available in the games, even if rare. So maybe after the popularity of Ash's Greninja, people actually started breeding real Battle Bond Greninja as kind of like exclusive merch, and they'd be given to fans of the anime as gifts, which is why the Sun and Moon protagonist gets one, alongside a letter from quote-unquote Ash, so that they can pretend that they actually have his cool Greninja. And to explain why the anime sometimes follows plot points of the games, especially with the evil teams, we can say that the writers of the anime took inspiration from recent real-world events, and they'd even based some characters on real people. HGSS Giovanni drowned. In the Heart Gold Soul Silver Celebi event, you can travel back in time to when Team Rocket hijacked the radio station to call for Giovanni. However, you travel to Tojo Falls, where Giovanni is hiding out in a cave. He hears the broadcast and is ready to come back as the leader of Team Rocket. You're there to stop him, and after you beat him in battle, he becomes completely disillusioned, shocked that he was beaten by a kid once again. He declares that Team Rocket's dream is impossible to achieve, and then exits the cave, when a strange, splashing sound is heard. Considering the splash noise, the fact that this version of Giovanni is never seen again, and the fact that none of the Pokemon he had on him knew water, fall, surf, or fly even, it's likely that he jumped into the falls and drowned, believing his entire life's goal was a waste. Levels don't determine evolution. This is actually a pretty good theory that in the games, levels are a mechanic only for the player, and that they're an easy numerical way to show growth and strength. However, other NPC trainers may use different training methods that have their Pokemon grow stronger, faster, and thus evolve earlier. This would explain Pokemon like Lance's Dragonites, who, because of his training, evolved earlier than they would with the player. Ash's Pikachu lost weight. Pikachu was chubby when first introduced in the anime, but became slimmer as the seasons of the anime went by. Of course, the actual reason was to match the company changing Pikachu's design to be more of a cool mascot. But I think it's funnier to think that all the battling he's doing made him lose a few pounds. I mean, the dude's a top athlete now, of course he lost weight. Deoxys is mutated Pokerus. Pokerus is a virus that can afflict Pokemon and even spread within your party. It was introduced in the Gen 2 games and has been in all the mainline games except for Scarlet and Violet. It's also been referenced in other media. However, the virus isn't harmful, but rather beneficial, doubling an afflicted Pokemon's EV gains. While the origins of Pokerus are unknown, many people believe it originates from space, and may be related to Deoxys. In fact, we know that Deoxys is a mutated virus, and since the only virus we know of is Pokerus, we can connect the dots. Another connection is that Deoxys can change forms to boost its attack, defense, and speed. We already established that Pokerus promotes EV growth, which can selectively boost your attacking stats, defensive stats, or speed stat, so it makes sense that a mutated Pokerus would take that to the extreme, being able to switch between being really fast, really strong, or really bulky. Imposter Oak. In the TCG, there's a card called Imposter Oak. We don't know who he is or why he's impersonating Oak. Parasect is a zombie. Paras is a bug with mushrooms growing out of it. When it evolves into Parasect, the mushroom grows larger and the bug itself has blank white eyes. Multiple Pokédex entries state that the mushroom drains the bug of all of its energy and does all the thinking and decision making, using the bug body as a host to move around. So yes, Parasect is a zombie of sorts. It's based off the real-world Cordyceps fungus, which infects host bugs and essentially kills them, and then uses their body to maneuver to a location where the fungus can spread to more hosts. This also serves as the inspiration for the zombies in The Last of Us, which imagines if Cordyceps was able to spread to humans. Girl in the OP. In the first Pokemon opening theme, a girl briefly appears. You'd expect a character featured in the OP alongside Ash to appear in the show, but she never does. Was she a scrapped character? Well, no. While the girl is out of place if you watch the English opening, her inclusion makes sense in the Japanese opening. The Japanese opening starts with lyrics singing about the places you can find Pokemon. The line says you can find them in dirt, clouds, and even up that girl's skirts, which is when the mystery girl shows up. So yeah, she's not an actual character, but just a generic girl design added specifically for that lyric. And then, when the clips from the opening were re-edited to match the English song for the Western airings, the clip with the girl was included, but without any lyric referring to her. Thank God. So, all the English viewers were confused to who this girl was and why she was in the OP. And it's not like people back in the late 90s and early 2000s can just hop on the internet and look up the Japanese opening, which is why this mystery spread around. Humans become ghost Pokemon. Ghost Pokemon are weird in their classification. Some are spirits or monsters that have qualities that we may consider ghostly, while others are actually supposedly souls of deceased humans. According to the Pokédex, Pokemon like Yamask and Phantump are actual deceased humans. Yamask are said to hold a mask which resembles their face from when they were human, and even sometimes look at it and cry. Meanwhile, Phantump are said to be the souls of children who died while lost in the forest. However, since we already established that the Pokédex entries are likely not factual, it's entirely possible that these Pokemon are naturally occurring spirits, and the notion that they're the souls of dead humans are just urban legends that are spread around within the Pokemon world. I hope that's the case, because if not, the implications of capturing a dead kid and forcing them to fight is something I don't want to think about. Calyrex Blue Dynamax. Normally, when a Pokemon Dynamaxes or Gigantamaxes, it is circled by red clouds and a red glow. However, when Calyrex Dynamaxes, it is circled by blue clouds and a blue glow. Calyrex is the only Pokemon that has this blue Dynamax, and it's not explained in-game why this is. However, the explanation is pretty straightforward, to the point where many in the community came up with it individually. Every other Pokemon Dynamaxes or Gigantamaxes using the energy of Eternatus, which gives them that red aura. However, Calyrex uses its own energy to Dynamax, which is why it has that blue aura. It makes even more sense if you look at its history. Calyrex used to be the king and defender of Galar, so why would it use the energy of Eternatus, a danger to Galar? Of course it would use its own energy to Dynamax. Zygarde and Terastallization. A now debunked theory is that Zygarde was somehow responsible for Terastallization. This was because we knew back then that the unknown legendary responsible for Terras had a bunch of hexagons and a serpentine head shape. Zygarde matched these attributes, so there was a crackpot theory that a Zygarde 200% form or something would beat this legendary. Of course, we now know it's Terapagos. Rui sensing shadow Pokemon. In Pokemon Colosseum, Rui has the ability to sense shadow Pokemon, even though humans normally can't tell if a Pokemon is a shadow Pokemon. Maybe it's an ability similar to what the Aura Guardians have, where instead of people being born with the ability to sense aura, she was born with the ability to sense shadow, if that makes sense. Player's original life. Every player character in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon was a human in their past life who lost their memory and was reborn essentially as a Pokemon. Considering that humans don't exist at all in Mystery Dungeon, people have wondered about the details of the player's previous life. However, I always assumed the human past life was just referring to us, the real-life person. After all, we're the human that's the same mind as the player Pokemon. They even base what Pokemon you get as your player off of a personality test. Mewtwo based on Gygus. Gygus is a main antagonist in the Mother series of games. Some people theorize that Mewtwo is actually based on Gygus. Both look very similar. Both have powerful psychic powers. Both were raised by humans who betrayed them, which caused them to be bitter and hateful towards humanity. And considering that Pokemon was inspired by Mother in other aspects, as well as the fact that people who worked on Mother later went on to work for Pokemon, I do think Mewtwo did take heavy inspiration from Gygus. Ryuki Home Region. Ryuki is a character who appears in the Alola games. He's a rock star who comes from a distant region seeking fame. He is a Dragon-type trainer. Despite his pretty iconic design, he never appears in another game, so people have wondered where he's actually from. His team doesn't help us with this, as he mostly uses Alolan Pokemon. Considering that he appears in the Cantonian Gym in Maui City and talks about wanting to be a gym leader once Alola gets real gyms, some say that he is from Kanto, or maybe a member of Johto's Dragon Clan that Claire and Lance are a part of. The fact that his name is Japanese also strengthens the theory that he's from one of the Japanese regions. However, I like to think that he's from Galar. Galar has a culture centered around gym battles, which are massive spectacles, so of course he'd find Alola's lack of gyms weird and want to bring gyms there. Also, we know that Galar, specifically the city of Hammerlock, has a large amount of Dragon-type trainers, with Lance even training there at one point, so Ryuki wouldn't be out of place there. Also, Ryuki is a rocker who's wearing a very flamboyant outfit, which reminds me of the British glam rockers that grew popular in the 70s and 80s. Also, Galar is heavily inspired by the ideas of rock and performance in general, so Ryuki would fit in with that aspect too. Gen 8 Victini Event. In the Crown Tundra DLC for Sword and Shield, data miners found information for a static Victini encounter. However, nobody was actually able to figure out where Victini is in-game, and thus began community-wide searches and rumors unseen since the days of Mew under the truck and Jirachi on the moon. People were willing to try anything, and crazy theories were spread around. You had to beat the Galarian Star Tournament with every single partner. You have to clear Dynamax adventures 100 times in a row, and then Victini would show up in the next one. You'd need to have Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem in your party and go to this specific location. Eventually, people came to the conclusion that the Victini data was just unused, but everybody still acknowledged that it was fun spreading around baseless rumors like the old days. In the modern era, stuff like that is rare since everything is data mined and leaked now. Champion before Blue. Normally, one would become champion by earning the gym badges, beating the Elite Four, and then beating the champion to take their place. In Kanto, we do the same, where we beat Champion Blue to become champion ourselves. However, Blue became champion right before us, on the same day. This begs the question, who did Blue defeat to become champion? Well, the correct answer is nobody. We know this because of Lance's dialogue. Once we beat him, he tells us that we would be champion now, except that a trainer beat him before us, Blue. So we have to beat Blue before becoming champion. The dialogue implies that if we had beaten Lance before Blue, we would have been able to become champion without fighting a previous champion. So why wasn't there a champion before Blue? The only other scenario where a league didn't have a champion is the Alola League, and that was because the league had just been established, and we were its first champion. The Council League, however, is long established, so they should have had a champion. The only answer I could come up with is that they were fine with having an empty champion slot, and were just waiting for someone who would be able to beat the Elite Four. Then after Red vacated the champion position between the Gen 1 and 2 games, they decided to restructure the league, with a new Elite Four and Lance as the new champion. Pokemon Fusion. Pokemon Fusion is a very popular concept in the community, and there is a pretty fleshed out fan game revolving around the concept. However, there are canon examples of Pokemon Fusion. Slowbro and Slowking are the results of Shellder fusing with a Slowpoke, although I'm still mad that the shell looks nothing like a Shellder. Magneton is 3 Magnemites fused. Metagross is just 8 Beldum fused together, apparently. Kyurem Black and Kyurem White are actual proper fusions of Kyurem with Zekrom and Reshiram, respectively. Similarly, Necrozma can fuse with either Solgaleo or Lunala. And finally, we have the Galar fossils. which are mishmashed abominations created when somebody resurrected fossils that contain bones from different creatures, which is just an amazing idea for a Pokemon. I love them so much. And Calyrex can fuse with Spectrier and Glastrier, but I don't think that's actually fusion, it's just Calyrex riding the horse. So yeah, Pokemon has been toying with fusion in very specific contexts, and I do think it's likely that we get a game with fusion as a gimmick, not like where any Pokemon can fuse with any other Pokemon, but where like certain pairs of Pokemon can only fuse with each other. SM Ash Greninja is the same as the anime. This theory states that the Greninja you get in the Sun and Moon demo is the same as Ash's Greninja from the anime, like it just jumped dimensions from Ash to you. To be fair, this is likely what was intended. There are a bunch of fun details in Greninja's information that support this idea, with the original trainer name being Ash and the date obtained being October 17th, 2013, which is the date the episode Ash got his Greninja as a Froakie aired for the first time. However, I like my personal theory better, that the Battlebond Greninja was just a gift for in-universe fans of the in-universe anime, and the idea that it's really from Ash is like how we tell kids their Christmas presents are really from Santa. Firestarter Zodiac. This is an older theory that the fire types are each based on an animal in the Chinese zodiac. Charizard is a dragon, Typhlosion is a rat, Blaziken is a rooster, Infernape is a monkey, Emboar is a pig, Delphox is a dog, Incineroar is a tiger, and Cinderace is a rabbit. However, any legitimacy this theory had fell off after the introduction of Skeledirge. Skeledirge is based on a crocodile, which is not close to anything in the zodiac. For some reason, some people got mad at Game Freak for making a Firestarter that's not based off of a zodiac animal, even though it was just a theory and not anything official. Also, the theory was already suspect, since I don't think anyone can call Typhlosion a rat in good faith, nor Delphox a dog. Rayquaza is primal. When Groudon and Kyogre undergo primal reversion and enter their primal forms, they stay mostly the same except for the lines in their body that grow yellow. Rayquaza has similar yellow lines on its body, even in its normal form. So, is Rayquaza always in its primal form? Maybe. Primal forms seem to be the true forms of super ancient Pokemon. Maybe Groudon and Kyogre needed the extra boost from their stones to reach their primal form, since they spent so much time dormant. But Rayquaza never fell asleep, so it just always stayed in its primal form. Holon region. The Holon region is a region that only appears in the TCG within official media. It is the home of Delta Pokemon, or Pokemon that look the same as other members of their species but have a different type than expected. It's also said to be the home of Mew. Considering that Mew was originally said to have come from South America, it can be implied that Holon as a region is based on South America. We know that Holon consists of forests, lakes, a mountain range, and island chains, which can fit a South American region. Who knows, maybe we'll see it come to an official Pokemon game in the future. Paldea Atlantis. In the code for Scarlet and Violet, some unknown data was given the codename Atlantis. This was likely a location in the DLC, and many people thought that the land that used to be in the Area Zero crater rose up into the sky, creating a floating landmass that we could explore in the DLC. Of course, this didn't happen, and I'm pretty sure the Atlantis name was referring to the Blueberry Academy, being a massive underwater structure and all. Falkner is the strongest Johto gym leader. This is specifically referring to the manga. The legendary beasts travel around Johto to challenge every gym leader, and while they challenge most 1-to-1, they challenge Falkner 2-on-1, and he actually does pretty well. So he'd be the strongest since he does the best against the legendaries. But going back to the games, it makes sense for him to be the intended 8th gym in universe, since his gym is the closest to the Pokemon League, like Giovanni's in the Gen 1 games. But since the player lives close to him, he uses a much weaker team in-game, since we fight him as our first gym. Ransei is the supercontinent. The Ransei region is the landmass where the Pokemon Conquest game takes place. Of course, it's obviously shaped like Arceus. However, with Conquest taking place in the past, many people have theorized that Ransei is a supercontinent, a single continuous landmass consisting of different regions before they split apart into continental drift, like Pangaea in our world. Normally, the process of continental drift takes hundreds of millions of years. Human civilization has not been around nearly long enough to even see a significant change in the continents, much less to the extent that this theory implies. However, since Pokemon is a fictional world that has gods that are said to move continents, I'm willing to accept this amount of drift can happen. What I can't accept, however, is how the community subdivides Ransei. This is an older theory, so this map only has the regions up to Unova. Even if we exclude Alola, I don't see where Kalos, Paldea, and Galar can fit. Also, I'm not even convinced by the existing subdivisions. It seems like the person who made this image just drew random lines in the Ransei map and claimed them to be the modern regions, even though their claims were based on nothing. They must have been British. Puka is Alolan. Puka is the name of a Pikachu that shows up early on in the anime. It has blue eyes and loves to surf. Puka might actually be a Pikachu from Alola, since Alolan Raichu surf on their tails and have blue eyes. Makes sense to me. Erika and Valerie are Kimono Girls. The Kimono Girls are a group of trained performers from Johto known for their traditional clothing and use of evolutions. We see two other women wearing kimonos in the modern Pokemon games, Erika and Valerie, and it's possible that they were or are Kimono Girls. They look the part. They also both have evolutions that no other Kimono Girls have. Erika could have Leafeon, in fact she does have one in the anime, and Valerie's ace Pokemon is a Sylveon. I wonder if we'll ever see a Kimono Girl who uses the last remaining evolution, Glaceon. Pinkin Pokemon. There's an anime episode where we come across an island full of pink Pokemon, even including Pokemon that aren't usually pink. It's explained that they're turning pink due to the fruit that they eat on the island. Looking back on this now, it's likely that these Pokemon are undergoing the first steps of change to become regional forms. Pokemon 2000 Adventure. Pokemon 2000 Adventure was a browser-based game made to promote the Pokemon 2000 movie. It was developed by Cyberworld International Corporation and distributed by Warner Bros. The game follows the same premise of the movie, with the player character traveling to collect ancient spheres from the legendary birds. You would choose between different teams of Pokemon, with every Pokemon having special abilities required for navigation. The game was from a first-person POV, with the environment being a 3D world with 2D sprites, kind of similar to the original Doom. You would travel in this 3D world, using your team's powers to clear obstacles and make your way to the legendary bird, answering a Who's That Pokemon style trivia question to get their ancient sphere. On the way, you can interact with overworld Pokemon as well as Pokeballs, which give a variety of effects ranging from evolving one of your Pokemon to getting one of your Pokemon stolen by Team Rocket. Based on how well you do, you get a point score and a bronze, silver, or gold ranking. Nintendo had licensed the production of the game out to an exterior developer since they thought it wouldn't be anything too significant. However, Cyberworld had done too good of a job. Nintendo was not expecting the game to be as fleshed out as it was. They just wanted some silly browser minigame that a few kids would play when bored. However, within the first month of its release, it got over 1 million downloads, which was way more than expected. Nintendo, not wanting this game to overshadow their own Pokemon games, or otherwise muddle the Pokemon brand, sent a cease and desist letter to Cyberworld, forcing them to take down the game. So yeah, not only does Nintendo take down fan content, they also take down content that they themselves licensed out. Since then, the game has become lost media. While some files and images from the game were floating around the internet, since the game was online browser-based, it would basically be impossible to find a copy of this game. Well, that's what I would be saying if I was writing this a year ago, because the game has been found and restored to a playable state. A YouTube channel called All Games Ever had an episode talking about the Pokemon 2000 game, and would actually invite some of the developers to talk about it. Turns out one of the devs still had a working, albeit semi-incomplete version of the game on his computer, which he played for the episode. However, in the months after that episode, some other people helped the devs to recomplete the game and get it working on modern browsers, and the game would now be playable by the public after over 20 years. I guess this was considered a mystery or conspiracy when the original Iceberg image was made, due to the fact that the game was lost and obscure, but now the mystery is solved. I guess that's a silver lining about my large gaps between uploading. I get to have more up-to-date information. Alder is the legendary hero. In both the villages of the Diamond and Pearl clan, we can see this painting of a man who looks like Alder. Considering both the clans seem to respect him, we know he's an important figure who transcends the rivalry of the clans. The only figure who matches that description is the legendary hero. To recap, the legendary hero was a person from Hisui's ancient past, like from the Celestica people's time. He traveled around the region with his 10 Pokemon partners, collecting all 18 of Arceus' plates and challenging Arceus to a battle. Arceus, impressed with this hero, blessed his 10 partner Pokemon. with those becoming the first generation of noble and ride Pokemon. Then, atop Mount Coronet, the Temple of Sinnoh was built to honor him and his 10 Pokemon. Since both the Diamond and Pearl clan worship the descendants of the ancient heroes, noble and ride Pokemon, it makes sense both of them would revere the ancient hero. So, like other characters in Legends Arceus, we can say that this ancient hero in the painting is just the ancestor of an existing character, Alder. However, there is evidence to suggest that he is just straight up Alder himself. I think that almost right after his battle with Arceus, Alder was sent to Unova in the far future by Arceus, kind of how like the player was sent to the past by Arceus. First, we'll take a look at his design. Alder is one of the only Pokemon characters who visibly carries more than 6 Pokeballs on his person. If we take a look at his 3D models from games like Masters, we see that he actually carries around 12 Pokeballs. This is more than enough to carry around his 10 partners we know he had in Legends Arceus. Also, the portrait of the ancient hero shows him wearing 6 Pokeballs around his neck, like Alder. Now, I know some people say that those are just beads and not Pokeballs, and that Pokeballs may not even have existed those thousands of years ago. The handcrafted apricorn balls are said to have been created in Johto around 700 years ago, which is still too recent for the legendary hero to use them. But considering Johto is a less developed region, I can stretch and say that apricorn balls were actually being created in Hisui centuries before the art made its way to Johto. So yeah, let's say that the ancient hero was wearing Pokeballs around his neck. There is also some other evidence that points to Alder being the ancient hero. In the Japanese versions of the Gen 5 games, Alder speaks in old-fashioned Japanese, which nobody else in the games do, even other elderly characters like Drayden. Also, according to an interview with the Pokemon illustrators Ken Sugimori and Yusuke Omura, the reason Alder wears a bunch of Pokeballs is because he was never able to figure out how to use the PC storage. Once again, a strange quirk which is unique to him, as other elderly characters in the series, including those who look visibly decades older than him, have no issue in using a PC. This evidence implies that he was raised in an extremely old-fashioned society, maybe one from thousands of years ago he time-traveled from. Also, taking a look at Alder's backstory, as well as some other facts, we can piece together a story of what happened. Alder said that in his younger days he spent his time focusing on getting stronger. However, his first starter Pokemon, which we are later told was a Volcarona, died of illness, which was devastating for him, and he began traveling around to deal with it. If we take this story, as well as some other facts, we can piece together a story of Alder as the ancient hero. So, in those ancient Hisuian days, Alder was a member of the Celestica people, and was the proud owner of a Larvesta, an incredibly rare Pokemon who will evolve into a powerful Volcarona. He and his Larvesta, later evolving, traveled around Hisui, becoming stronger. However then, Stark Mountain erupted, covering Hisui's skies in ash that turned the already cold winters unbearable. However, in this time, Alder's Volcarona stepped up, becoming a substitute sun to keep the Celestica people and Pokemon warm. Volcarona's Dex entries state that during a time when volcanic ash covered the sky, and during a bitter cold winter, Volcarona's fire served as a substitute for the sun. However, this responsibility turned out to be too much for Volcarona, who developed an illness because of all the work it was doing and then died. This caused a collapse of the Celestica people, with many of them leaving while others stayed. Remember, one of the old verses say that when their source of light and warmth disappeared, the Celestica civilization collapsed. Maybe Alder's Volcarona's death was this light disappearing. Alder, now not only dealing with the grief of his Pokemon's death, but also feeling guilty that he may have failed the Celestica, wanders around the region. On this journey around Hisui, he meets his 10 new partner Pokemon, and finds some of the Arceus plates. He makes it his new mission to find and fight Arceus, angry at Arceus for allowing all this to happen. He finds all the plates and makes his way up to the peak of Mount Coronet, challenging Arceus. He fights Arceus, putting up a good fight. Arceus is impressed and grants him several blessings. First, he removes the ash from the skies of Hisui, bringing light and warmth back to the land. He blesses Alder's 10 Pokemon, turning them into holy, noble, and ride Pokemon. And finally, to heal the grief in Alder's heart, Arceus blesses him with a new start, sending him to a new time and place, Unova in the far future. Here, Alder is gifted with a newborn Larvesta, which would go on to become the Volcarona he uses in the player's battles against him. Back in the past, the remnants of the Celestica people, now scattered around Hisui, learn how Alder literally met God, and with the help of his 10 Pokemon, got Arceus to bring back the sun. He became known as a legendary hero, and the people of Hisui banded together to build a temple at the peak of Mount Coronet in his honor and the honor of his 10 partner Pokemon. Back in Unova, Alder never fully recovered from his past grief. He became strong with a new team, and was even asked to become the champion. However, he still avoided responsibility, still feeling as he failed to Celestica, so he told the Elite Four to watch over the region for him while he wandered around Unova. However, his worst fears came true again when Team Plasma took over the league and he was beaten by N, once again feeling as if he failed in protecting the region. However, he eventually found inner peace after, and by the time of Black and White 2, he embraced helping young children, leading them down good paths, knowing that would lead to a brighter future. This was a bit of a long theory, but that was because there's just so many puzzle pieces that fit together so well. Alder's backstory, the old verses, Volcarona's dex entries, it all just comes together to make a satisfying story. If this was intended by someone at Game Freak, I'm truly speechless, since this is probably the most digging you would ever have to do for a plot point in Pokemon, especially one so minor, and I doubt we'll ever get a concrete answer, since it's likely Alder or the legendary hero will never get any new information about them. Abyssal Ruins Great King. In the Abyssal Ruins of Black and White 2, you find inscriptions on the wall of a great and noble king. There are also some other strange messages, including 8 commandments of sorts, and a message stating that primes lead to truth, referring to prime numbers. The inscriptions aren't written in a real language, but rather some strange hieroglyphs. We know what they say since the plasma sage Zinzolin has documents providing translations. However, he couldn't decode certain words, one of which being the name of the king. However, it is implied that the name is Harmonia. This is because the unknown symbols in the ruins are represented in Zinzolin's notes as a series of dots, each dot corresponding to a letter. In the Japanese version, there are 5 dots. There are 8 dots in the English version, and 7 dots in the Spanish version. The number of dots in each version corresponds to the amount of letters in that language's translation of Harmonia, and it makes sense. Gestas says that he and Anne are descended from kings, and Harmonia are their last names. Well, I mean their full last names are Harmonia Gropius, but it could be a case of like 2 last names, with Harmonia being a maiden name that stuck around due to its importance. Also, it seems like the old King Harmonia placed a lot of importance on prime numbers, and N himself is known to be a mathematician, and prime numbers are actually used in the composition of his musical themes. So yeah, it's very implied that the king mentioned in the Abyssal Ruins was a Harmonia. Why HMs need badges. This is part of a larger question I have, which is, what exactly does the Pokemon League do? Are they the government? Are they just a hobby league for battlers? Well, the answer is that when making Pokemon, Game Freak needed boss battles and a final boss gauntlet, and instead of coming up with something more natural and integrated with the world, they just came up with gyms and an Elite Four, where people just stand around waiting for challenges. However, over time, they did come up with ideas on how to fit the Pokemon League into the world, instead of just being something that was included for the sake of being included. In Gen 7, the Pokemon League was the region modernizing their old government system of kahunas and cultural system of trial captains. In Galar, the Pokemon League was just a typical big sports league, which is what most people think the league is, but in reality Galar is the exception here. The Paldean League is typical when it comes to the Pokemon Leagues in the game, with the exception of Champion being a rank that you get, rather than an individual title. But other than that, the league consists of people who have normal everyday jobs and just act as a gym leader when a challenger shows up. The gym leaders certify the strength of trainers, and if they beat their test and win the battle, they get certified with a gym badge. Another thing gym badges allow, at least in the older games, are the use of HMs in the overworld. You would not be able to use the moves to travel or navigate the world until you got the badge for it. This makes sense. If you're strong and responsible enough with your Pokemon to get a certain amount of badges, you would be allowed to use them to navigate across the world. It's also why you can still teach a Pokemon the move, but not be able to use it outside of battle. Like, your parents can buy you a car, but you still can't drive it until you get your license. Water from Pokemon is undrinkable. Since most water-type Pokemon moves seem to just generate water out of nowhere, it can be implied that the water Pokemon create is very pure, only consisting of just H2O molecules. However, in real life, the water we drink is not pure. Even really clean water still contains minerals that are beneficial to our health. If you drink pure H2O without all the other stuff in water that our body needs, after some time your body won't have the electrolytes it needs, and that's when health problems start to arise. But if you drink a glass of pure water, nothing bad will happen to you. It only becomes a problem if you just drink pure water every day. So yeah, you can drink water from your Pokemon if you're in a pinch, but if you're using your Vaporeon's water gun every day to save on your water bills, I've got bad news. Lucas and Dawn are their own ancestors. Pretty simple theory. When the Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum protagonists got sent back in time to the events of Legends Arceus, we never actually see them get sent back to the present, so we just assume that they lived the rest of their lives in the past. So it's likely that they grew up, had kids, and those kids had kids, and so on until one of their descendants, likely Johanna, gave birth to them. This is a common trope in time travel stories, someone being their own parents or grandparents. Scientifically, this is impossible, since it's unlikely that someone's child or grandchild will look exactly like them. DNA doesn't work like that. But considering that Legends Arceus takes place around 1870 and the Gen 4 games take place around 2000, there are enough generations separating them to the point where it becomes somewhat feasible that you could be your own ancestor. I always assumed that your opposite gender counterpart in the game was your ancestor. Like, if you went back as Lucas, your ancestor was Akari, since she would then be a separate person from the player. Or maybe both you and Akari are your ancestors, who knows. Singular timeline. Almost every Pokemon theorist believes in the two-timeline theory, with there being a mega timeline and a non-mega timeline. However, it's possible that we are just complicating things and that there is only one singular timeline. Like, nobody considers that the original Gen 1 games and Fire Red and Leaf Green are separate timelines. They just kind of merge all of them into one event in the timeline, usually picking a game to act as the definitive version of those series of events. The singular timeline says that we can use the same logic with the Gen 3 games and the remakes. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are the same as Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, you just pick which one is the definitive version. We can wave away Megastones as always existing in Hoenn, the mechanic just wasn't there in the original. For example, nobody is saying that the Gen 1 and 2 games exist in a different timeline, because the Pokemon in those games don't have abilities. We just assume that abilities were inherent to Pokemon, it's just that the first two gens didn't show that mechanic. With this logic, the timeline would just consist of the most recent iterations of the game, and not care about any other version of the game that came before. And to be honest, the fact that we use Mega Evolution as a standard for which timeline a game is in doesn't make sense, since Megas aren't a permanent thing across regions. It would make more sense if Megas are just found in certain regions and aren't used in others. However, the dual timeline theory still prevails in my opinion, since Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire's Delta episode directly points out that there is another universe where events happen differently. Essentially, in the Delta episode, scientists at the Moss Deep Space Center want to save Hoenn from an incoming meteor by using a special device and a rocket to warp it to a parallel universe. However, Zinnia disapproves of this plan, saying that the people of the Draconids know of this parallel universe, which contains a world similar to theirs. However, there were a few key differences, such as that the AZ War 3,000 years ago never happened, and that the people of that world did not know about Mega Evolution. Zinnia did not want to place the burden of the meteor on the people of the other dimension. Of course, Zinnia was obviously talking about the dimension where the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald took place, a Hoenn without Mega Evolution. This is definitive dialogue in the game which confirms at least two major timelines with significant event changes, not just fan speculation about technical and minor differences between games. So, I think the dual timeline theory beats out the singular timeline theory. And that is it for Layer 3 of the Pokemon Conspiracy Iceberg. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll try to get the next part out soon. I know that you guys look forward to these. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.